Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to be doing my March wrap-up. And in this wrap-up, we are only going to be talking about the books that I actually finished. So there were enough books that I DNF'd that I actually did make it its own video. So if you are interested in my DNFs, I will leave a link down below to that video once it goes live. But talking about just the books I finished, starting with Sweep in Peace and One Fell Sweep by Ilona Andrews, books 2 and 3 in the Innkeeper Chronicles series. So the Innkeeper Chronicles series is an adult urban fantasy, or maybe science fiction. It could be argued either way. But we are following our main character of Dina, who is an innkeeper whose inn serves as a way station for the aliens passing through this part of the galaxy. But the kicker is that Earth does not know aliens exist, so it has to be kept very, very hush-hush. Now, in this second book, Dina, maybe against her better judgment, is hosting a peace summit between 3 warring factions, and of course chaos ensues. And then in this third book, Dina is approached by an alien species who is asking for her to keep them safe from another alien species who is like really bent on genocide. So keep them safe while they are bringing together the component parts of a hive mind to be able to ask that hive mind where they can go to be safe. And if she does this, they will allow her to ask the hive mind a question as well, which Dina is very interested in. I really like this series. So the first book was a little bit rough, basically in everything, from like the characters to the world building to the plot to the writing itself. These 2 books are much better. So the second book is definitely a huge step up, and I feel like the third one is a step up from that in many ways. I like the characters for the most part. There are some characters that I don't like, but they're still well written. And I still like the character interactions with them because they are well written. I like that we've got this like found family kind of vibe coming together with this group. I really like Dina. Ilona Andrews is really, really good at writing female leads that are very, very competent, and she is great in this book. In this third book, we also do meet Dina's sister Maud, who brings out a different side of Dina, which is really great. The world building is fantastic. This is another thing that Ilona Andrews does really, really well. And this series is no exception. And then the plots themselves are also pretty well done. Sometimes I could see what was coming, but it was still really a joy to watch the story unfold. So all around, generally, most of the parts I really liked. I will say that in this second book, the ending was just shy of abrupt. I did have a little bit of whiplash. So that was not my favorite part, but honestly, it was more than made up for by the cameos we got from some characters from her other series, which were really great. But overall, I really, really liked Sweep in Peace, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And then in One Fell Sweep, the only negative I have to talk about is a slightly bigger negative, and that is that the chapters are a little bit longer and they seem to lack focus. So basically what would happen is that I really enjoy this world. I enjoy these characters. I was enjoying the plot, but the chapters they were pushing along the story, but didn't really seem to have their own little mini arc. And because of that, I would find myself in the middle of the chapter being like, when is this going to be done? Like, when am I going to get to the end? Which is not what you want. So like, I think that if they had been a little shorter and a little bit more narrowly focused, it would have been significantly better. And unfortunately, it didn't affect my enjoyment. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars. But so still, the overall, very, very strong. And then I went ahead and picked up Well Met by Jen DeLuca, which is an adult contemporary romance. It's the first in a series, and in this one we're following our main characters of Emily and Simon. Emily is visiting her sister to kind of help out as her sister is recovering from a car crash. And part of that helping out means that she has to volunteer at the local Renaissance fair so that her niece may volunteer at the local Renaissance fair. And she immediately butts heads with the person in charge of the fair, Simon. But once the fair starts, her character of Emma the Tavern Wench finds herself enmeshed in a flirtation with Captain Ian Blackthorne, which is Simon's character. So Emily starts to think that maybe there is actually something there. And the story goes from there. I, for the most part, did not like this book. So I'll start with the good. The banter between Emma the Tavern Wench and Captain Ian Blackthorne is so good. It is so spot on. I really, really adored it. This is the only thing that kept me going through this entire book. So let's get to the negatives. I didn't actually like either of these characters, especially in the beginning. Emily is really judgmental. We find out later that like Simon reminds her of her jerk of an ex-boyfriend, but unfortunately, because we don't get that context early enough in the story, it just seems like Emily is a jerk. And like Simon almost doesn't have much of a personality, except sometimes he's jealous. Like that's all the only emotion. Well, stressed out and jealousy. Those are like the two emotions we see from Simon, which is not great. And then, like, just generally the problems that they have between them are more what I call kind of young people type communication problems, which isn't necessarily to say like that's not me deriding younger people and their problems or anything, but more like it's a very specific type of communication problem that is more of an issue when you're like early 20s rather than somebody like me who is almost 35. And so because of that, it feels more new adult, and that's not generally the kind of romance that I want to pick up. And I really had a problem because they had this flirtation, and like, which was totally fine. That's a great way to figure out you have chemistry, but then you have to build the foundation of the relationship outside of that flirtation, because like when you're doing a performance, you don't really know what's real and what's not. But we didn't get that foundation building. We didn't get them really getting to know each other. So like I was not invested in this relationship kind of at all. And then, okay, I'm going to take him like 30 seconds to be really petty. But like Simon is just like, you've never been wooed. I'm going to woo you. And then what he does is the most generic romantic gesture I think I've ever seen in a book. So it's just like, no, just no. And then of course, like with the side characters, they're also not communicating well. There's weird, like rough writing in the beginning. It smooths out, but again, another problem in the beginning. So it was just like so badly not for me. Like this just did not work for me at all. Continuing on with the trend of I just don't like the popular YouTube popular kind of romances. But I ended up giving Well Met 3 stars. I don't have any plans to continue this series, and I don't even know that I would read another book by Jen DeLuca. So unfortunate. And then the next book I have is Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky by Kwame Mbalia. This is a young adult middle grade, I think it's more middle grade fantasy series. It's in the Riordan Presents series. And this one has African American folk tales and mythology. And essentially we're following our main character of Tristan, who recently lost his best friend and is grieving. And so when he loses his very first boxing match, his parents decide to send him to his grandparents' house down in Alabama. But the first night that they're there, something steals Tristan's best friend's journal, and he is determined to get it back. And in his determination, punches a hole in the sky and lets loose an evil spirit. And so now he has to fix it. And I'm not going to actually say too much about this because I do not have the grounding necessary for this book. I found myself really quite adrift. I am still learning more about Black culture, about Southern culture, which, you know, those can overlap, but they can be their own distinct thing too. But like those two things. And also, it turns out this made me confront the fact that I actually don't know anything about American folklore, let alone Black American folklore. So like I just didn't have, like, we did get explanations of some of these figures within the book, but it wasn't quite enough for me because I didn't know these stories. Like, it wasn't a remind. It felt more like it was a reminder, but I didn't need a reminder. I just needed like the whole story. So that part didn't, like, because of those two things, I felt very, very adrift in this novel. So like, but that's like my thing. That's not, I don't think most readers are going to feel that. What I will say is I think that the plot is serviceable, like the plot beats and everything. I think it's decent for a middle grade novel. I really like the fact that it's storytelling as magic. So storytellers weave magic as they are telling their stories. And that is such a cool thing. Like, I love that so much. But yeah, like I kind of struggled with this book, but again, personal problems. So I ended up not rating this book mostly because I do not have the expertise necessary to be able to tell you if this book did a good job of what it was trying to do. So I read it. I think that it would probably work really well for a number of readers. So there you go. And the next book is The Magpie Lord by K.J. Charles. So this is the first book in an adult historical fantasy romance series. It's called A Charm of Magpies. And in this, we are following our two leads of Stephen Day and Lord Crane. Lord Crane has had a curse put on him, and so he contacts Stephen Day to kind of help break it. But they very quickly realize that this is just one thing that is being lobbed against Lord Crane, and so Stephen has to help keep Lord Crane alive, even though he'd really rather Lord Crane and his entire family just hang. And the story goes from there. So one thing to note is that this is a darker plot line. There are a ton of content warnings. I would encourage you to look them up if you have a need. I believe the ones on Storygraph are accurate, so you can use the link down below. But it is much darker. And the romance itself is less a sweet, fluffy, romantic moments kind of romance, and it is also a little bit darker. And there is some sub-dom kink in here. So it's not like full dark, but it is definitely a step in that direction. And especially if you're used to like very sweet, traditionally published romances, this really isn't that. Now, I wasn't expecting either of those things, and I will say it definitely affected my enjoyment of this, but I do think there were still some things that were done really well. So I liked the characters. They were a little bit underdeveloped. I know that so this series is actually a trilogy following the same characters. So I assume that we're going to actually get more character development as the series goes on, but I think I would have preferred it to be a little bit more front-loaded, especially because it is a romance. Now, the interactions between the characters were really fun. I liked the interactions between Lord Crane and his manservant Merrick probably the best, but I did also like the interactions between Stephen and Lord Crane outside of the sex and romance part of it, because they just didn't know what to expect with the other person, and they keep throwing each other off balance, and it's just really fun to watch. The plot itself is actually really interesting, and I liked that. That's really what kept me coming back to this book. The magic is also interesting, but not well explained in parts. So some of it I really got, some of it I really didn't, which is unfortunate because some of the plot relied on a better explanation of the magic. And so some of the plot points got muddled towards the end, which is not great. So like overall, very mixed feelings on this book, but I ended up giving it 3.25 stars. I am interested in like continuing on with this series, especially now I know what to expect, but I don't know exactly when that's going to happen. I also did read the short story at the end called Interlude with Tattoos, and I thought that this was really nice. It's basically like, it's very short. It's pretty much what we get is like an interaction between Lord Crane and Merrick, which was fantastic. And then these letters back and forth between Lord Crane and Stephen. And I thought that those were a little bit more on the sweeter romantic side, which I genuinely like. Just, I thought that they were done well. So I gave that 3.5 stars. And then I picked up The Hammer of Thor by Riordan. This is the second book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series. And so this is a young adult fantasy series, and because it is Riordan, it is mythology based, and in this case, it's Norse mythology. And we are following our main character of Magnus Chase, and he is really starting to finally settle into his role at Valhalla, but a lot of weird things seem to be happening all at once. Like, he realizes he hasn't seen his oldest friends in a really long time, and there's this new hallmate that's just causing chaos, and then he finds out that a certain hammer is still missing, and so he decides to go investigate. And for the most part, I thought that this was a really nice sequel. It was really good to see Magnus settling into himself a little bit more. I also really just genuinely liked the other storyline, the other characters' storylines that we got, especially Sam's and Hearth's. So they're both dealing with some really relatable kind of life problems, and it was really interesting to see them work through how they're going to handle it. It was just really nicely done. And we got the introduction of a new character, Alex. Alex is a great balance to Sam within the group, and honestly, it just made this group feel fuller, more complete than it was before. And so that was great. I also like that Alex is gender fluid, because it meant that the author was able to include conversations in it, like introducing this idea of gender fluidity, and also how to like talk about it and talk to somebody who is gender fluid without accidentally putting your foot in your mouth. So even though as an adult sometimes those conversations felt very heavy-handed, I think it's a really great way to introduce the concept to younger readers. Now, the plot. And this is actually the part where I had the biggest struggle, because even though the plot was really like, it wasn't a rehash of the first book at all, but it followed the same kind of beats, to the point of like, in the first book, we went to Blitz's homeland and he had to kind of do things there to progress on with like the, journey that they were on. And in this one, it wasn't Blitz's homeland, it was Hearth's homeland. And it was still the same kind of thing where he had to deal with his past and, get what they needed to be able to continue on with the journey. So it's that kind of thing where it's like you swap out like the characters or whatever, but it's still the same basic idea for a storyline. And that's unfortunate because it made it very familiar to the point of being kind of boring, honestly, because it felt like I had read this before. So even though it was completely new, and honestly, if this were the first book, I would have said it was a great plot, because I had read the first one and it's like following the same lines, it wasn't interesting. And so I kind of actually struggled a little bit with this. So yeah, that's really unfortunate. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. I don't think it's bad, but yeah, I wish that there had been something a little bit different with the plot. And then we have Not Your Villain by C.B. Lee, which is a young adult superhero series set in the future. We are following our main character of Bells, who is currently being maligned as a supervillain. And he and his friends are trying to figure out the extent of a conspiracy theory and what they can do about it. But when they go to the adults with their findings, the adults refuse to act, and so Bells and his friends must figure out how they are going to proceed. And the story goes from there. I know that's a little bit vague. I'm trying really hard not to spoil the first book, and this is really, really heavily based on the first book. So now this book, I also had very mixed feelings about, but more negative. And so this is okay. So first off, the characters. We didn't get a ton of development or growth in any of the characters, and I think it's mostly because there were so many characters in this that we just didn't have the time. And then Bells himself felt kind of flat. Like, we're in his head, and most of what he's thinking is about his crush on his friend, or the fact that he feels kind of like a third or fifth wheel within his friend group. And so it's just so much about his romantic life, and it's not well balanced against the main plot line, so it feels like it just kind of took over this story. And then also, this book does this really weird thing where this book starts before the events of the first book, and we go with Bells to his training, and then we see the events of the first book through his eyes, and then we start the second, and then we start this actual, like, the plot line for this book. So it was like 100 pages of stuff we had mostly seen before. Now, the seeing him at training was actually really interesting, and it gave us some information that we really did need for this story. But the recap portion, like seeing things from his perspective, the events of the first book from his perspective, wasn't particularly well done because we didn't get a ton of his insights. We didn't get a ton of new information about it. So it was just an extended recap, which made these first 100 pages kind of really boring and just unnecessary. And then it was 100 pages. This book is only 300 pages long. So we only had 200 pages for like the main plot line of this book. And so then the main plot line felt very thin and very rushed. So like overall, there was a lot going on in this book that just didn't quite work in the same way that like the first book kind of worked, which is unfortunate because it took this series, which had this promise of being very charming, and turned it into something that I don't really have any interest in continuing. So I was very disappointed in this. I gave it 3.25 stars, and I'm not going to continue on with this series. And then the last thing, well, not the last thing for this month, but for this clip at least, that we have to talk about is The Black God's Drums by P. Djèlí Clark. So this is a young adult historical fantasy novella, and in it we are following our main character of Creeper, who is a thief in New Orleans. And Creeper manages to overhear some very interesting information, and so she decides to take it to a very specific captain of an airship in the hopes that she can bargain her way onto the airship with this information, and very quickly becomes embroiled in a much, much larger situation regarding this information. And the story goes from there. Sorry, vague, I know, but it's a novella, so very hard to give a description without spoiling anything. But generally speaking, I liked this. I had a little bit of a harder time connecting with it, but I think it was genuinely well done. I will give a warning on the upfront that the dialogue for both Creeper and the airship captain is written in dialect. So Creeper is Black and from New Orleans, and the captain is also Black and Haitian. And so it is written in dialect, and so just a heads up, if you're like me and don't really have the internal voice, and you either need to read it out loud or or listen to the audio, then you can plan to do so. But otherwise, I thought the plot was really nice. It was, it felt like a full and complete story, which is just genuinely hard to do in a novella. So that was really great. I loved this alternate history kind of setting. We're in the 1800s in New Orleans, but like very alternate history. It was fascinating, but I did have some amount of problem with the execution, in that like the characters would mention these little like things that were different than our own history, which is fascinating, but we got just a little bit too much of it, just a little bit too much information. So it's like I felt like it wasn't quite balanced well. We either needed a little bit less so that like I'm aware that they're just talking back to each other, and so I'm not trying to like fit it into what I know, or we needed a little bit more so that like I could more easily fit it into like the history of this world. But we got like this like slightly in between amount of like information about it. It was just, it wasn't great, unfortunately. I think that it, and I do think the story suffered a little bit from it. The characters themselves are fine. I didn't really connect to either character. I didn't necessarily think that they were like super well developed, which is really understandable for a novella, but they got the job done in a very interesting way. So not complaining really. But overall, I did really like this. But between like the world building and then the dialect, because I didn't realize that this is the story where I realized that I don't have an inner voice. So I was still trying to just read it. Between those two things, I did struggle to connect with this story, but I think that I would enjoy it and connect with it better on a reread. But yeah, good quality. And so I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then we have Spelunking Through Hell by Seanan McGuire, the 11th book in the Encrypted series, which is an adult urban fantasy series where we're following a family of cryptozoologists who study and liaison with and sometimes kill the monsters that the rest of the world doesn't even know exists. And in this book, we are following Alice, and Alice has been on a 50-year journey trying to track down her husband through the various dimensions, and she thinks that she finally has a lead on where he is, and so she is going to go and check it out, and the story goes from there. And I really enjoyed this book. So it's been fascinating because the first 10 books have all been from the perspective of Alice's grandchildren, and they have a very interesting perspective on cryptids and what they do and all of this stuff. And Alice has a slightly different perspective on it because she is the grandchild of the people who came over from England. And so it's just interesting to see the differences. It's also really interesting to see the differences, like, so her kids have a very specific perspective on Alice, and then we finally get to see Alice's perspective on herself. And she's not the most reliable narrator that I've ever read, but it is really fascinating to see. And honestly, I just really like her as a character. And so we had a lot of introspection in like the first bit of this novel. And then once we got into the action, it was very fast paced, very interesting. I think that this is a great addition into this series. It very much feels like the end of a chapter. So it felt like we fight, like the beginning to 11 books have their own kind of story arc, and we can clearly see that the story's not done, but it is the end of a chapter, and now we're getting pulled into the new chapter, and I'm really excited to see where this series goes. This has made it, I think this is the book really where I feel like, okay, I actually really enjoy this series. I enjoyed it before, but now I really enjoy this series. So I am excited to get to more. I gave this 4.25 stars. It's somewhere in the 4.2 to 4.5 star range. But like for all of my websites, I gave it 4.25 stars. And then we have Tofu Quilt by, the author is covered up, sorry, Ching Russell, which I am probably mispronouncing. I apologize. I tried to look it up and I didn't find it. But this is an elementary school poetry collection, which I read specifically to fulfill a prompt for the Avengers Readathon. I definitely wouldn't have picked this up otherwise, but I really liked it. So this is actually like the author is writing poetry to kind of talk about her childhood in Hong Kong and how she decided to become a writer. And it was just really good. I don't normally like poetry because it's harder for me to understand it, but because this is written for elementary school kids, I did fine with the understanding. And I thought that the language, I really found the language to be beautiful. So yeah, I would never have picked this up, but I actually really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. And then we have Rosemary and Rue by Seanan McGuire, the first book in the October Day series, which is an adult urban fantasy series where we're following our main character of October Day, who is half human, half fae, and eventually a knight in the fairy courts. And she tends to be the one who's asked to solve really weird problems because she's best suited to solve them. In this book, she has a curse put on her to force her to solve the mystery of the death of this pureblood fae. And so she has to get herself back embroiled in the fairylands, which she has been avoiding, to figure out who killed this pureblood so that hopefully October doesn't end up dead, which is what will happen with this curse. And the story goes from there. Now, this is fascinating. This is a reread. This is one of my favorite series, the October Day series. And this first book is a reread. And so I actually reread this 2 years ago as well. And before that, it had been a long time since I had read it. But 2 years ago, I was surprised at how bad it was. Because this is a debut urban fantasy novel from 2009. And it feels like it. Like, every part of that, it just feels like every part of that description. And so 2 years ago, it had been so long that I forgot how rough it was. And so I didn't like it. So going into it this time, I remembered how much I didn't like it the last time I reread it. So this time I was actually pleasantly surprised because I thought I was going to really, truly hate it again. And I will say it is rough. The writing itself is rough. There's a lot of info dumping in it. I will say the info dumping, it feels like there's a lot of extraneous stuff, but there isn't, because almost every single bit of it ends up being important later in the series. So it's hard to see that that's actually useful information because it's not used in this particular book. The characters are it's a little bit difficult to get next to October because she's very depressed. She doesn't use that word, but that is like how she is written. And so she's not like an Eeyore or anything, but it's still, you can still tell she's depressed. And then just in general, this plot is a little bit more difficult for me to enjoy because she's reacting to things as they happen rather than taking an active part in figuring out what to do next. And it is partially because things keep coming one after the other, but still it's just I don't love those kinds of plots. There are also a ton of content warnings in this, specifically because October uses blood magic. So again, look up the content warnings if those are things that you need. But I still will say that this is probably my least favorite book in the series, but it's better than what I remember. So I ended up giving it 3.25 stars. I am going to continue on with a reread of this series. Also, if you're interested in a full-length review, I did it 2 years ago, and I will leave it linked down below. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, before we talk about the book, I want to say that for the most part, if I'm reading something specifically to fulfill a prompt on an Avengers board for the Avengers Readathon, and I don't like the book, I'm mostly just not going to mention it on the channel because it seems really rude to me to be like, hey, here's a book that isn't genuinely all that interesting to me. I would never have picked it up on my own, and I hate it, right? I don't really want to do that. So for the most part, I'm not. However, I am going to mention this one, which is New Superman by Jen, Luen, Yeung. And this has very, very mixed reviews. Personally, I came out as I did not like it. The only reason that I'm mentioning it is because there's fatphobic remarks throughout this volume, and nobody seemed to be mentioning it on Goodreads. So I wanted to mention it. There are fatphobic remarks throughout this volume. Proceed with caution if that's something that you don't really like to deal with. So that is it. That is everything that I read for this month. It was a very, very good month. I'm very happy with what I managed to accomplish. So real quick, we're just going to run through the points that I earned. So first up, Sweep and Peace and One Fell Sweep each gave me 2 points because they are a book in a series. Well Met gave me 3 points because it's was number 10 on my Goodreads. Tristan Strong gave me 1 point. The Magpie Lord gave me 2 points because it's a romance. And then I also gave myself a point for Interlude with Tattoos. Hammer of Thor gave me 2 points because it's a book in the series that I'm in the middle of. Same with Not Your Villain by C.B. Lee. That also gave me 2 points. The Black God's Drums gave me 3 points because when I picked it up, it was number 5 on my Goodreads. Spelunking Through Hell gave me 3 points because it is the last currently out book in a series. Like, it's not the last book in the series, but it's the last book that I can read because it's the last one that was published. Tofu Quilt gave me 1 point. Rosemary and Rue gave me 1 point. And then Superman, the new Superman, gave me 2 points because it's a graphic novel. And then additionally, I got 6 points from my DNFs, which means I got a total of 31 points in March, which means overall I have 102 points, which means that I have already reached my goal. So my goal was 100 points by the end of June. So I've already smashed that. I've already gotten it. So, I am going to be doing some rearranging with my goals. There will be a whole video, a goals update video coming up probably next week where I talk about it. But just as a preview, I am going to be giving myself a stretch goal. We'll see how that goes. But that is all I have. So if you have any thoughts or feelings about any of the books that I have read this month, please leave me a comment down below. Just a reminder, if you're interested in my DNFs, it will be in a separate video, and that will also be linked down below. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.